Welcome everybody, those that are joining. This is great. Welcome to our second Love Your Lake Zoom talk for 2024. As you all know, this is being recorded, and those that are unable to attend can go to our YouTube site and watch it there once it's uploaded. There's lots of our other talks. I think this is the third year we've been doing this. Is that right, team? So yep, there's some nods. Yep. So there's other talks that are there. Feel free to go back and review some of them because there's some good information in there for all of us to know. Well, it's 7:30. We'll get started, and I know people will drop in as they are able, but welcome and thank you again for joining us to our second annual Love Your Lake Zoom talk for 2024. As you probably know, my name is Kirsten, and I would like to introduce you to your LKO board. And so board members, if you wanted to just wave a hand, that would be great. Feel free to keep your, I'll call your names first, people. But if you want to keep your videos on for right now, that would be great. Just so that you can see everyone, but I would introduce your LKO board members. We've got Jan, who's unable to be here today, but there's Wendy, who's also unable to be here today. Oops. And then there's Kathy. She can wave. There we go. Tanya. There we go. Scott Sharman. There we go. Scott McPhee. There we go. Dale. There we go. There's Lance, Marilyn, and Italo. I don't know if they are here. I don't see them on my screen at the moment, but they're all hardworking members of the LKO. And we're happy to bring these seminars to you and our LKO community. They're meant to be informative and bring everybody together, and so that we can learn to protect and bring awareness about our lake and its surroundings. So tonight's speaker is Howard Skimcover, and he has spoken to us before, and he'll be speaking on the celestial shadows of the eclipse of the sun. As you all know, the conclusion of the talk, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. Please use the chat function. When Howard starts to speak, make sure that you turn off your video and mute yourself throughout his entire performance so that we can keep his presentation at its primo reception. And if we don't get to all of your questions and comments, we can certainly look to Howard to answer any of them at a later time. Reminder that this is being recorded, and you can look at it at a later time if you need to. So let's get things started. I'd like to introduce you to Tanya. She's going to do our land acknowledgement.
As we gather here today, we respectfully acknowledge that we are situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Mississauga lands that are traditional territory covered by the Williams Treaty. Kashagwigmog and Anishinaabe name, meaning lake of long and winding waters, served for millennia as an important passageway and meeting area for the First Nation peoples. We are grateful for the opportunity to live here, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years.
Thank you, Tanya. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to Kathy, who's going to introduce you to Howard.
Yeah, just a very short introduction because it's too great a talk for me to be interrupting at the beginning. Anyways, Howard Skimcover, you may remember, he spoke to us last year about the night sky. He's an electrical engineer by training, and his great love is astronomy, and he's brought that to the public for the last 50 years and more at planetaria and museums all over. So tonight, it's going to be a talk about not the night sky, but the daytime, and something really exciting coming up. Welcome, Howard.
Thank you. Thank you all. This is a great pleasure for me to be here. And let's just get right into it. I will share the screen. And what we need to do is back this up to the beginning like that. There's a little gray bar that you see that will disappear in a moment or two. Okay, I have been involved with astronomy my entire life, really going back to the age of 7. And one of my great fascinations has always been eclipses of the sun. So it's really a pleasure for me to spend this time with you tonight to talk about eclipses and about the upcoming event that I know you're all aware of, which will happen on the afternoon of Monday, April the 8th. So a total eclipse of the sun, a very rare and beautiful event, is coming to Canada in less than 4 weeks. Now, the last total eclipse of the sun in Canada was more than 40 years ago. It was on February 26th of 79. And I'm just going to try to let someone into the... Okay, thank you. Someone has done that. So it was 40 years ago in 1979, and I was actually there in Manitoba. There's a picture of me on February 26th of that year. It was a beautiful, clear day in Gimli, Manitoba, and that is the view I had of that eclipse. These are rare events for any particular region. The next one in Canada is in 20 years, in August of 2044. That's going to be a sunset eclipse in BC and Alberta, and I hope we all see that one as well. So tonight's presentation really has 3 segments or components. I'm going to talk about eclipses, what causes them, why they are perceived to be rare events. I'll give you some examples, a bit of a personal journey of some eclipses I have seen. And then we will focus on the upcoming event, how you can see and enjoy this beautiful event in a safe manner on April the 8th. What I like to say is that eclipses are really about alignments and shadows. And alignments can happen in the skies of the Earth because most of the planets and the moons in our solar system are actually orbiting around the sun in the same geometric plane. So to see this, let's step back and step outside the solar system and look back in.
Howard, sorry to interrupt, but I don't know if anybody else, but my screen is totally frozen. I'm just still on the previous one in Canada was February 26, 1979
Manitoba.
in Manitoba.
Gee. Okay, let's share again. That should not be. Can you see the solar system?
Yes, I can.
Okay, we are unfrozen. Thank you for that.
Okay, you're welcome.
So when we look at the solar system, you can see the planets orbiting the sun, and you can tell that they're all in more or less the same flat plane. And the fact is, most of the moons going around the planets are also in more or less the same plane. Now, those of you who were outside last night looking up at the sky, perhaps around 8 o'clock or 8:30 in the evening, maybe you saw this. And here is the moon next to the planet Jupiter in the skies on March 13th. And the only reason this alignment or conjunction can happen is because the moon and Jupiter and the Earth are all orbiting in about the same plane. And it's this geometry that leads to eclipses. This geometry also means that the shadows of the moons can fall onto the planets like this. So here you see the planet Jupiter in a fairly large telescope. And at the left, you can see 2 of Jupiter's approximately 80 moons. These moons, you can see, are casting shadows onto the upper atmosphere of Jupiter. That's the shadow of this moon. This is the shadow of that moon. So if you were in the upper atmosphere of Jupiter, in that spot of darkness, you would actually see the sun completely covered. You'd be experiencing a total eclipse of the sun. So it's these shadows that are the cause of solar eclipses. In terms of our own planet, it is our own moon shadow falling on the Earth that is the cause of total eclipses of the sun on our planet. The moon is, in fact, a fairly small object compared to the Earth. It's roughly 1/4 the diameter of the Earth. And to those of you of the mathematical inclinations, it means we could actually fit about 64 moons inside the Earth and even have a little bit of room left over. But through an amazing coincidence, and it's nothing more than a coincidence, the sun is 400 times larger than our moon, and it's actually also about 400 times farther away. Now, what this means is that if you put the sun and the moon side by side in the sky, they each subtend about 1/2 degree of arc. They appear to be almost exactly the same size. It's an amazing and very fortuitous coincidence, because if it means that if the alignment happens to be right, and if the moon passes across the sun, it's just big enough in apparent size to cover up the sun completely. There are two types of solar eclipses that I'm going to speak about, the two major types, the total and the annular or ring of fire solar eclipse, and we'll start with the total. So let me give you just a taste of the experience. In 2012, my wife and I traveled to Northern Australia for a total solar eclipse there. This is an early picture of the eclipse where the sun is partly covered by the moon. This is taken through a filter, and I'll be talking about filters a bit later. The progression of the moon across the sun takes a little over an hour. It's very slow. The light gradually diminishes as the sun is covered. But then in the last minute or so, when the sun is almost completely covered, that's when it gets amazing, stunning, and beautiful. I've got this gray bar up here that we will get rid of. Sorry about that. This is what it really looks like. When the sun is completely covered, you can see the sun's atmosphere, the corona of the sun stretching out to a very large distance. You can see structure within the corona. These rays of structure are actually following the magnetic field of the sun. What is really happening here is that the moon is orbiting in space around the Earth, traveling at more than 4,000 kilometers an hour. The moon, being a solid object, has a long conical shadow, 360,000 kilometers long. The shadow can barely reach the surface of the Earth. Where it touches the Earth, it traces out a path of the eclipse. We call this the path of totality. It's never more than about 250 kilometers wide and sometimes much less. The area to the north and south of the path of totality experiences a partial eclipse of the sun, but to get the total eclipse, you must be in that very narrow band. Now, the shadow at the beginning of the path is traveling at more than 7,000 kilometers per hour. Near the middle of the path, with respect to the ground, it slows down to roughly 3,000 to 4,000 kilometers per hour, but it's far faster than a jet aircraft. Only a supersonic plane can keep up with the shadow of the moon. Now, there is a real picture that is taken from a spacecraft looking down at the moon shadow in August of 1999. That particular eclipse crossed England, went into Europe, where it was cloudy, passed over into Turkey, where my wife and I and many other people were. So that actually is me in the blue t-shirt, my wife in the red t-shirt. And you can see we are looking up at that eclipse in a perfectly clear sky, and a very beautiful eclipse it was. I mentioned that the path of totality is never more than 250 kilometers wide. The path of the upcoming eclipse in April is narrower, around 170 kilometers wide. Now, you want to be not near the edge of the path, either the northern edge or the southern edge, because you will get there a very, very short period of totality. You want to be, if you can, somewhere near the middle of the path. We call that the central line of the eclipse. And if you're near the central line at the upcoming eclipse, you will get more than 3 minutes of totality. The shadow moves very quickly, as I mentioned, several thousand kilometers per hour. So the shadow will pass over you in 1 or 2 or 3 minutes, depending on where you are. Now, a question you can ask is, are these things really as rare as they are cracked up to be? Well, if you were listening to CBC Radio News on December 19th, they had a point to make about it.
She's one of the most famous performers on the planet, but Celine Dion's sightings seem more rare than an eclipse.
Well, maybe and maybe not. You see, the real answer to this question is yes and no. If you stay in one particular place and you don't move, if you stay just in Toronto or Haliburton or Milwaukee or Ottawa, you will wait on average around 360 years between total eclipses of the sun. But if you're willing to travel, not only within North America, but around the world, somewhere on the Earth, you can experience a total solar eclipse roughly every 1.5 years. So in a lifetime, if you travel, you might be able to see 30 or 40 total solar eclipses. It's actually possible. An eclipse of the sun can only happen at a very special time of the month, and that is the time of new moon. So what do we mean by this? The moon is traveling around the sun, as we all know, in 1 month. And as the sunlight strikes the moon, and as we look at the moon in the sky, we see the moon go through its regular phases, a crescent moon to a half-lit moon that we call the first quarter, onto a full moon, and so on. Now, if you think of the sunlight as coming from this direction, when the moon is at first quarter, when it's half lit, it's very obvious that the shadow of the moon is nowhere near the Earth. You can't have an eclipse of the sun at first quarter. It's only at new moon, when the moon is between the Earth and the sun, that the shadow has a chance of falling onto the Earth. But It doesn't happen every month at new moon. And the reason is why we don't have an eclipse every month is because the orbit of the moon is tilted or inclined to the orbit of the Earth by a little over 5 degrees. If we look at an example of what can happen, and this is the case where the moon passes not in front of the sun, but below the sun. Let's look at it a bit more closely here. And we see here, in this case, if we are on the Earth and we look towards the sun, we look in that direction. But if we look towards the moon, we must look downward at an angle. So if you look up here at the upper right of this image, this is what you see in the sky. The little blue circle, which is the moon, passes under the sun. It misses the sun by a few degrees, and there is no eclipse. Now, in fact, to have an eclipse occur, the Earth and the moon have to be at points in their orbits which intersect in terms of the orbital planes. And that situation actually happens twice per year, but even then, you may not get a total eclipse. You'll get some kind of an eclipse, but it's probably going to be a partial eclipse. You will only get the total eclipse somewhere on the Earth about every 18 months. Now, people who lived thousands of years ago, such as the ancient Chaldeans, the Mesopotamians, and the Egyptians, they were perfectly aware that when an eclipse of the sun occurred, that it was the moon passing in front of the sun. We've all heard stories that early peoples thought it was a dragon or some evil god that was eating the sun, but that's just a myth. The people in these early civilizations were absolutely aware that it was the moon causing the eclipse, but they couldn't predict it. They did not know when or where these things would occur. Now, the first person who made very accurate predictions of a solar eclipse was our friend Sir Edmund Halley, a little over 300 years ago. That's the same Halley who gave his name to the famous comet. He did not discover the comet, but he predicted its return. In 1715, in a time hundreds of years before digital computers and using only pencil and paper calculations and a very good knowledge of the position and motion of the moon, Halley made predictions of the total eclipse of May 3rd of 1715. He drew this map where he drew the path of the moon shadow over southern Britain. He was able to get the edge of the path calculated to within something like 5 miles. Amazing accuracy for 300 years ago. Now, because we know exactly where the moon is to within inches, literally, we can predict the edge of the path to within better than 1 meter of distance. And we know the time of the eclipse down to the 1/100th of a second in advance. Now, here are some eclipse tracks over North America in parts of the 20th century. This is not all of them, but some of them. So here is the track on Saturday, March 7th, 1970. You'll see that eclipse came up over Florida. It crossed the Carolinas and came up through Nova Scotia. 2 years later, there's the eclipse of July 10th, 1972. You see the track is over Hudson's Bay, northern Quebec, parts of the Maritimes, and it intersects the track from 1970 right there in eastern Nova Scotia. So if you lived in that part of Nova Scotia, incredibly, there were 2 eclipses passing over you in just 2 years. Unfortunately, it was cloudy both times. Now, the eclipse of July 1972 is quite famous. it was made famous by a song. And the song, I'm sure you all know, it was by Carly Simon, released in November of that year, You're So Vain. I'm sure you know the words. It was rumored for decades that Carly was singing about the actor Warren Beatty, with whom she had had a romantic relationship at one time. And it was only about 40 years later, I think in 2013, that Carly admitted she was singing about Warren Beatty, but also about two other men. So the description was really an amalgam of three different people. So where does the eclipse come in? Let's listen to a few bars of the song and all will be clear. Indeed, and the only people in Nova Scotia who saw that eclipse were in that Learjet 35,000 feet above the ground. Everyone on the ground was clouded out. Solar eclipses have also found their way into many books and movies, and I will speak about only one of these at the bottom. Dolores Claiborne was a book made into a movie by the American author Stephen King. I'm sure you all know Stephen King. You may have read many of his books, as I have done, not recently, but he wrote books about horror and mystery. There was The Pet Cemetery. There was the book It that was also made into a movie. Well, Stephen King lives in the state of Maine, and in July 1963, a total eclipse of the sun came down over Quebec and crossed the state of Maine. He included this eclipse in the book, and it appears in the movie released in 1995.
The eclipse lasted 6.5 minutes. They said it was some kind of record. It was a hell of a lot more than a thunderhead passing across the sun. It was beautiful.
And it was beautiful, but this is Hollywood. The eclipse did not really last 6.5 minutes. Over Maine, it was more like 2 minutes and 25 seconds. But the movie and the book were based on the real eclipse of July 20th, 1963. Here again are eclipse tracks over the world for parts of the 20th century. Now notice the eclipse track, the black line, for March 7th, 1970, over parts of the United States and Nova Scotia. And look to the left for March 17th, 1988. Now notice the shape of the track in 1988 is almost identical to the shape of the track in 1970, 18 years earlier. This is not an accident. There is an underlying geometric and mathematical truth here. The fact is that the sun and the moon appear to move in a pattern that repeats. The pattern has a duration of 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. And in that period, the sun and the moon come back to almost exactly the same positions in the sky. Edmund Halley named this. He called it the Saros cycle. And it means that if you have an eclipse today, 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours from today, you'll get another one. But the next eclipse gets shifted a third of the way around the Earth. And that's because of the 8 hours at the end. In 8 hours, the Earth makes 1/3 of a spin, so the next eclipse gets shifted to the west a third of the way around the Earth. Again, you might ask, if you have this cycle of 18 years, why don't we have to wait 18 years between total eclipses of the sun? And the answer is that there are many of these Saros cycles happening at the same time. There's around 40 or 45 of them occurring at the same time. The Saros cycles are given numbers. This is Saros number 139. It has 71 eclipses of the sun. It started with a partial eclipse near the North Pole in 1501, and it will end with a partial eclipse near the South Pole over 1,200 years later in 2763. Think for a moment of the spans of time that we are dealing with here. And there are many of these cycles occurring at the same time. In Saros number 139, here are 4 successive eclipses. So we had the eclipse of March 7th, 1970 in Mexico, the US, and Nova Scotia. 18 years later, the eclipse comes back on March 18th, 1988 over the Philippines and Indonesia. 18 years later, there's another eclipse in Africa and the Middle East in March of 2006. And then 18 years, 11 days, 8 hours later, the eclipse returns to Mexico, the US, and Eastern Canada. So there is the track in 1970. Notice the shape of the track. There's the track in 1988, the same shape. There's the track in 2006 over Africa and the Middle East. And here the track upcoming in a few weeks on April 8th of 2024. Now, I had the honor of actually being at the previous 3 eclipses in the Saros. So there I am in black and white film in 1970 in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. And there I am in the Philippines in 1988. And my wife Louise and I, believe it or not, in the Libyan Sahara Desert in March of 2006. So we are very much looking forward to the return of the moon shadow over North America on April 8th of 2024. So here's a summary of the concepts. And I don't think we mentioned this, but there will be a handout of something like 30 or 40 of these images, including this concept slide. I will be providing that to the LKO board, and this handout will be posted on the LKO website. So you don't need to take screenshots of these things or of others. They will be in the handout. So a solar eclipse can only happen at new moon, that special time of the month. You don't get an eclipse every new moon because of the tilt of the moon's orbit. Eclipses happen in this Saros cycle of 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. Successive eclipses in the cycle are shifted to the west 1/3 of the way around the Earth. There are many of these cycles happening at the same time, and therefore somewhere on the Earth you can see a total solar eclipse roughly every 1.5 years or every 18 months. So now we're going to go to segment 2, and I will give you some personal examples. The most recent total solar eclipse was 11 months ago, April 2023 in Western Australia. There is the eclipse track. It's a very narrow track in that case. It was at the widest only 40 kilometers wide. And you can see that it barely touches land in Western Australia, around 1,200 miles north of the city of Perth. My wife and I traveled to Western Australia. I was amazed at how big Perth has become. I was there many years previously, but it's now a giant metropolitan area with more than 1 million people. This is eclipse morning, April 20th, 4 o'clock, and we are getting on a charter aircraft to fly over 1,000 kilometers north to Exmouth and the path of the eclipse. Absolutely everything depended on this aeroplane. If the plane had been delayed, if there were a mechanical problem or whatever, we would have been stuck in Perth and we would have missed the eclipse at Exmouth. But the plane flew on time. We landed at Exmouth, went over to the beach at the Indian Ocean. We were in total around 1,500 people at this eclipse site. Here you see many people setting up equipment. Notice there's a few clouds in the sky, but nothing serious. Here is my wife Louise using a filter to look at the partially eclipsed sun. I'll talk lots more about filters later. And here is what she had to say.
So, it's Louise. I'm in Exmouth, Australia, and I'm about to see, apparently, total eclipse number 7 for me. And we're by the Indian Ocean, which I think is very romantic. And everybody here is very busy like a bee, observing each other and observing what's happening in the sky. And it's a very good place to be.
And it was a very good place to be. Notice how blue the sky is behind us. Now here's the equipment that I used. Notice the filter on the end of the camera lens. That's very important for the partial phases. And you must remember to take the filter off just as the eclipse becomes total. Friends of mine, some of whom are very experienced, have forgotten in all the excitement to take the filter off, and they ended up with no pictures of totality. So you have to be careful about that. Notice the eclipse t-shirt. And if you're thinking of buying a t-shirt for the April 8th eclipse, you can get them in lots of places right now for something like $30 or $35 a pop. And as a word to the wise, on April the 9th, the price will come down by 50%. And a week later, they'll come all the way down to probably $1 per t-shirt if there's any left. So here is one of my pictures of the April 2023 eclipse. It's through the filter. The sun is almost completely covered. And a few moments later, the eclipse becomes total. I take off the filter. You'll notice the corona begins to appear, and we have this dazzling set of points of light, just the last tiny bit of the sun sticking out. This is called the diamond ring effect. You have to be very, very careful not to look at that without a filter. The camera saw this, but I did not. And a moment or two later, the moon advances from upper left to lower right. The diamond ring disappears. Here I take a somewhat longer exposure, and we can see the full extent of the corona and the internal structure of the corona following the magnetic field of the sun. It is absolutely safe to look directly at the corona, to look directly at the totally eclipsed sun without a filter. You can even look through binoculars. And on April the 8th, if you have binoculars, please use them to look at the corona. You will get an amazing and stunning view, very similar and probably better than this picture. The eclipse in Australia was very brief. The path was very narrow. It lasted 62.4 seconds. So the second diamond ring appears, we put the filters back on, and the eclipse is over. Now I'm going to play you a little video. I had a GoPro camera that was pointed at me, and I want you to watch carefully the shadow of my tripod here. As it gets dark very quickly, the shadow disappears, and that's when totality begins. Notice that the sky also deepens very significantly at totality. And listen when I call out, the corona is appearing, the corona is coming out.
Jupiter as well, actually, now.
There, the corona's out. The corona's out.
Oh, yes, you can see the corona.
Howard, I think you're muted, or we just can't hear you right now.
Yes, I am back. This is a stunning emotional event, and it's amazing to be surrounded by 1,500 people. It is life-changing in many ways. So I cannot recommend this more highly. If you have a chance to be in the path to see totality on April the 8th, please take advantage of this very, very rare event for Eastern Canada. Now, there's another type of eclipse that I will mention, the annular solar eclipse, also called the Ring of Fire. The orbit of the moon as it travels around the Earth is not a circle, it is elliptical. So sometimes the moon can in fact be 10% farther away than at its closest distance. And it sort of makes sense. If the moon is a bit farther away, it's going to look a little bit smaller in the sky, and therefore it will not be able to cover up the sun completely. So that is what causes this situation, the annular eclipse. The shadow does not reach all the way to the Earth. It may fall short of the Earth by as much as 30 to 40,000 kilometers. If you are directly beneath the moon, you will see the moon in front of the sun. You're in the path of annularity. It's not a path of totality, but you will see a brilliant ring of light around the moon. You must always use a filter to protect your eyes. The annular eclipse is interesting. It is not something I would travel, say, to Australia for, but I have traveled to annulars within North America. So the last one was 6 months ago in October in the Western United States. There's the track over the USA, Central America, and beyond. It went very close to Albuquerque, New Mexico. You'll see the central line, the green line of the path of annularity was just north of the city. Here is the central line, and I was aware there was a very large park within 2 kilometers of the central line of that annular eclipse. Here I am in Arroyo del Oso Park in Albuquerque the day before the eclipse. On the morning of the eclipse, we had a perfectly clear sky. There's my wife Louise and I set up with our equipment and our Canadian flag. Notice again the filter on the camera. The moon progresses from top towards the bottom. It takes a little over an hour to slowly move across. And you can see here very easily that the moon is a little smaller than the sun in its apparent size. The moon is simply not going to be large enough to do the job. Here are my pictures taken over a period of 4 minutes. The ring appears. The ring becomes a little larger. The ring of annularity is perfect in that picture, and that perfect symmetrical ring will last for only about 10 seconds. You've got 10 seconds to take that picture. The moon continues to move downward, the ring begins to break, and the ring breaks. I actually took a short video of this, and you can watch this in real time. This is not speeded up. This is exactly the way it looked. So watch the moon slowly, slowly move towards the bottom. And the ring just begins to break. And that is exactly the way it looked. Just to show you that things don't always work out the way you would hope, we had a cloud out in 2009. So here I am getting ready to get on this ship in Shanghai, China, and the ship was carrying 1,500 passengers out to the South China Sea to meet up with a very long total eclipse, one that was going to last more than 6 minutes. Well, here we are during the eclipse. Notice that I hardly have any gray hair in that picture, but notice the sky is completely cloudy, the decks of the ship are wet, and we were standing under pouring rain. So we saw absolutely nothing. And that happens sometimes. Nature gives you the eclipse, nature can take it away. I'm going to show you only one more before we turn to the upcoming eclipse, and we're going back more than 40 years. This was the eclipse of July 1981. It's in the Saros of the Dolores Claiborne eclipse of July 20th, 1963, the one that Stephen King wrote about. And you'll notice that it's 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours after the Dolores Claiborne eclipse. The track goes across the old Soviet Union and out into the Pacific Ocean. Here is the day before the eclipse in Bratsk, Siberia. There were quite a few clouds in the sky that day, and it was a matter of great concern. But the very next morning, on eclipse day, the sun rose into a clear sky. Here we are at the eclipse site. There were a lot of Canadians, and we had brought our own large Canadian flag. There I am, not a single gray hair to be seen, 43 years ago. Notice the equipment, and again, notice the filter on the end of the telephoto lens. I had the great honor at this eclipse to meet this person. So who is this, you might ask? This is Wendy Carlos. And even today, more than 40 years later, she is considered to be one of the best eclipse photographers in the world. Now, Wendy is famous mainly for her work in music. I'm sure you've heard about her. And in the 1960s and 70s, she was one of the first people to be composing on the Moog synthesizer. In 1968, she released this album. Some of you may have it, Switched on Bach. And a few years later, Stanley Kubrick asked her to write and compose the music to A Clockwork Orange. I was really pleased to meet Wendy and talk with her in Siberia. I met her one more time at an eclipse in Finland when we were clouded out, and she wrote me this little note, July 1990, to Howard, better luck next time. Signed, Wendy Carlos. And here are my pictures of the diamond ring at the beginning of totality in Siberia. Totality with the structure of the corona and the closing diamond ring. Notice here you see multiple beads of light at the edge of the sun. These are called Bailey's beads, and these are due to imperfections or irregularities in the edge of the moon. You cannot look at these with the naked eye. The camera saw these once again, but I did not. But I saw totality perfectly. I emphasize again that when the sun is completely covered like this, it's absolutely safe to look directly at the corona. As soon as the sun starts to reappear, you must look away and begin to use the filter again. So now we are going to come to the upcoming attraction, April 8th, 2024. An eclipse is coming to Eastern Canada. There is the track over North America. And just for transparency, I will say that my wife and I are actually going to be here at a place called Torreon, Mexico. We're going to Mexico because there is the greatest chance of clear sky there. However, there is still a good chance to see the eclipse on the other portions of the track. This will be in the handout that you're going to get, along with many other images. This shows you the expected degree of cloudiness as you come through the US and up to Ontario and Quebec. And in southern Ontario, there's about a 35% chance of clear sky. And if you have mobility and you're willing to drive east or west along the track, say the day before of the eclipse, you can increase your chances of seeing it and raise the probability to at least 50%. There is a view of the track through Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. And we will zoom in and take a look at some specific areas. Here is the track in Ontario. You'll notice that Kingston is in the track. Ottawa is north of the track. Toronto itself is outside the track. Hamilton is just within the track. I know many of you are in the Toronto area, so we're going to zoom in here. Notice the red line is the edge of the path. I emphasize all of this will be in the handout. So if you live in the Toronto area, you must get down south of that red line. Oakville is not good enough. You must get down to at least Hamilton and possibly further. Let's zoom in a little bit more. You notice that Burlington is barely within the track. Hamilton is largely within the track. And a great place to be would be Grimsby or Smithville, where you are closer to the central line and you will get a longer period of totality. I'm going to show you some of those times shortly. Now, if we switch over to the Kingston and Ottawa area and we zoom in, notice that Kingston is very nicely within the track. Although the central line is in upstate New York, Cornwall is within the track as well. Let's zoom in below Ottawa and notice the green line is the edge of the path. So to those of you who are in the Ottawa area, if you come down Highway 416, Kempville is not good enough. That's outside the path. You must get down to the 401 highway at Prescott or Brockville or Thousand Islands or Kingston. So you must get down within the path. Here are some times of the length of totality at various locations. And again, all of this is in the handout. So to those of you in the Toronto area, the Botanical Gardens near Hamilton will get only 1 minute. Grimsby gets close to 3 minutes, Niagara Falls gets 3.5 minutes. Near Ottawa, Kingston gets 3 minutes. Prescott, down at the bottom of Highway 416, gets 2 minutes and 30 seconds of totality. Now, you must have safe eclipse glasses or some safe filter for the partial phases. The Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, which I am a member, was selling these, but they are sold out. But do not fear, there are alternatives. Now, you must use a filter for the partial phases. Do not do this. This is Donald Trump at the eclipse of August of 2017, which was partial in Washington. He was told again and again, do not look up at the sun without a filter. But he did. His staff immediately jumped on him, gave him and his family eclipse glasses, and they used them. So he was very fortunate that he did not damage his vision by looking at the sun without a filter. Now, you must use the filter for the partial phases. That's a little over an hour. During the 1 or 2 or 3 minutes of totality, you do not need the glasses or any filter. In fact, if you keep the filter on during totality, you will see nothing. So you must take them off, but as soon as the sun begins to reappear with the second diamond ring, that is when you must use the filter again for the next hour as the moon gradually leaves the face of the sun. Now, there are many sources of these filters, and you'll notice that these are hot links. So these are places where you can order the filters, and please do not delay. All of these places are selling filters like hotcakes, and you definitely don't want to wait till the end of March or the beginning of April. Now, the other good news is that they are actually selling these glasses for the eclipse at some home hardware and some Canadian Tire stores for $2 or $3 per pair. And if, again, you act quickly, you have a good chance of getting these. I'm also told on good authority that many of the public libraries in Ontario will start giving away these eclipse glasses at the very end of March, but they will never have enough. And I recommend that you don't wait for that, but you take steps to get a filter now. I won't spend any time on this, but if you cannot get a safe filter, you can build this little box that is a sort of pinhole camera projector. And in the handout, you will find here a hot link that will take you to a website that shows how to build this device. It takes about 15 minutes to put it together, and it's a perfectly safe way to watch the partial phases. This is not for totality. This is only for the partial phases. So that is in the handout. Now, there are many interesting things that you can do during the eclipse, especially at totality, and I will show you a few of them. My wife and I are actually taking this kitchen implement to Mexico. You'll see it has a lot of little holes in it, and you can use little holes, such as in a hotel key, which is something I did when I took this picture a number of years ago. You can use the little holes to project crescent suns during the partial phases onto a piece of cardboard. It's quite interesting. During the partial phases, watch the way the shadows change. So I took this at an eclipse in 1994. Notice that when the sun is a thin crescent, the vertical shadows become very sharp, but the horizontal shadows remain fuzzy. And that's because in a horizontal direction, the sun is becoming almost a point source of light, causing the sharp vertical shadow, whereas vertically, the sun is still subtending a source of light of 1/2 degree, causing the fuzziness in the horizontal shadow. That's something you may wish to try. During totality, look around at the sky. It's not going to be perfectly dark. It's not like nighttime. It's like a very deep twilight. You are in the middle of the shadow of the moon. The edge of the shadow is around 80 kilometers away from you in all directions. So at the horizon, all around you, you will see this twilight glow. It's a beautiful and lovely sight. And this is what it looks like and did look like at the eclipse in Libya. Look up at the sky for bright planets. Jupiter will be above and to the left of the sun, and Venus will be below and to the right of the sun. You will see these very easily. In fact, you should be able to see Venus a good 5 minutes before and after totality. If you have animals near you, watch animals. They often become confused, and this can be very interesting to, in fact, keep track of. You might want to bring a thermometer with you. Here's a graph that I drew at the eclipse in 1994. It will get noticeably cooler during the eclipse, and in fact, the temperature may drop, as it did in this case, by as much as about 5 degrees Celsius. These are all interesting things that you can do. Do you want to take pictures? Well, I'm sure you do. But the best advice I can give you is what it says here. Please don't spend all of your time in totality taking pictures. You know, in the end, your pictures will look like my pictures. They will look like everyone else's pictures. You have a wonderful opportunity here to experience the event. Take pictures for 15 or 20 seconds, maybe, but please spend the rest of the time looking at the corona, experiencing the event, and basically embedding the memory so you can remember your 1 or 2 or 3 minutes in the shadow of the moon. And you will get this in the handout. It's again a hot link, and there's lots of advice there on how you can photograph the eclipse. You will get this as well. It's an extremely useful website that can help you plan. So, in terms of planning as a summary, what can you do? In southern Ontario, in the Hamilton and Grimsby area in Niagara Falls, totality will occur at around 3:20 in the afternoon. South of Ottawa, 5 minutes later. Think about that. The shadow of the moon will travel from Toronto to Ottawa in 5 minutes. Remember, it's moving at very close to 3,000 kilometers an hour. So what you can do is obtain a good and a safe solar filter for the partial phases. Please don't wait until the beginning of April. You will be out of luck. Please act now. Decide where you plan to be. Please don't stay in Toronto or in Ottawa. Yes, in those places you will get a very deep partial eclipse, but the partial eclipse is nothing compared to totality. It's nothing. You really need to be in the path to see the total eclipse. Don't try to drive south to the path at 1 o'clock. You will never make it. There could be 50,000 cars on the Queen Elizabeth Way or on Highway 416 south of Ottawa trying to get to the path. Make a day of it. Leave in the morning, bring a picnic lunch, and try to get into the path many hours before totality. Don't try to cross the border to upstate New York and get to the Central Line on eclipse day. You will never make it. There will be thousands of cars trying to do the same thing. In fact, some friends of mine are booking a hotel for the night before or the night after within the path. Watch the weather websites and adjust your plans as required. And if you have mobility with a car, that is going to be very useful. If required, you may want to drive east or west along the path to get to clear weather. So good luck. I hope you see this. I hope you have a wonderful experience, and I hope you have a clear sky wherever you will be for this rare and beautiful event. We're going to close with a video that I hope you enjoy. I want to give credit to the many people who have contributed images to this video. Some of them are mine, but most of them are images from other people from around the world. You will also see some images from Wendy Carlos, for example. And as you watch this, I hope you will realize along with me that this is a beautiful and stunning and wonderful event, a total eclipse of the sun. And it has been a pleasure. So I'm very happy to take questions or comments. I will stop the share at this point, and I will turn you back to Kirsten, who will moderate the Q&A. So thank you all very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Howard. What a wonderful presentation. So exciting to look forward to April the 8th. So there was a few comments and suggestions. Thank you, Howard, someone for an excellent presentation. One of the questions that was presented was Howard, will we be able to see the eclipse from Halliburton, Ontario?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so can you tell me, Halliburton, I believe, is north of Toronto. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So that's outside the path of totality by a certain distance. So it's going to be a partial eclipse in Halliburton. It will not be total. It's probably going to be 95 or 96% partial.
97.
So 97. So you will not experience the phenomena of totality, such as the corona, the diamond ring, the darkness of the sky. You will not see any bright stars or planets. So if you're in Halliburton, I'd say please try to get south into the path where you will experience all of these wondrous things.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Good words of advice. Another question is, what is your experience for photographing totality? Your exposure, camera settings, auto or manual settings, time lapse or video, or still, can you get both prominences or corona?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the eclipse is very forgiving at totality. So you want to take different exposures, and I take a range of exposures from very short to longer, as much as about 1/4 of a second. So when you take the longer exposures, you'll get the full extent of the corona. When you take shorter and shorter exposures, you will bring out the innermost corona and the prominences. These are these jets of hydrogen gas coming off the sun, and they showed up in 1 or 2 of my pictures. So what I would suggest is you use the website that is in the handout, How to Photograph an Eclipse, and that will give you all of the advice that you need, the F ratios, the ISO number, the shutter speeds. That will give you everything that you need and more. But it's very forgiving.
Will it give you the kind of filter you're needed for an SLR camera as well?
Well, remember, at totality, you don't need a filter for totality. For the partial phases, you must have a filter over the camera lens.
Do you know what questions is what kind of filter is needed for an SLR camera?
Yeah, so I get it. And I'm using an SLR myself. So the filter, you have to order from a special place. You can't get this from Home Hardware or whatever. You have to basically go on the web and look for that. A very good place you can go to, and it's not in the handout, is Khan Scope Center. That's KHAN. Khan Scope Center is in Toronto, and they will sell you very good filters to put over your camera.
Perfect, thank you. Another question is, why is it okay to look at the total eclipse and not the partials? And why do you only see the corona during the full eclipse? So I guess the first is, why is it okay to look at the total eclipse and not the partials?
Yeah, what can damage your eyes is ultraviolet radiation coming off the sun. Even if only a very tiny amount of the sun is visible, 1% or less, there is enough ultraviolet radiation coming off to damage your retina. So you must use the filter when any portion of the sun is not covered by the moon. Now, the corona is not giving off ultraviolet radiation. The corona is actually about as bright as the full moon, literally. It's perfectly safe to look at it. When the moon is completely in front, covering the sun, you can look directly at the corona, no problem whatsoever. Now, there was a second part of the question, I think, right?
Yes, and why do you see only the corona and during the full eclipse?
Yeah, it's because it's so much fainter than regular sunlight. It's, as I say, about as bright as the full moon. So when the sun is shining, the corona is completely invisible. You can't see it in relation to the bright sunlight. You must take the sun out of the picture by covering it up, and then the corona shines in all of its glory.
Beautiful. I don't know if there's any, that's all the questions that have been put in through the chat. If anyone else has any other questions, while I'm waiting for that, if someone has one other question, I'll just mention to people that there's 2 other sessions coming up. Not that we want to not appreciate what we're going through, but there's 2 other sessions coming up on March the 20th and April the 17th. And obviously April the 8th is an important date to watch the eclipse. But to look to our website to register for the police talk, Safety on the Water with Dave Moffat, and then Dr. Chris Hauser from the University of Waterloo. He'll be presenting on April the 17th his results of the wave study at the on our lake that was monitored last week. I thought that might give people a bit more time, Howard, to ask any more questions that they might have. But
okay, while people are thinking, I'll mention a couple of other things. So you can also use this as a filter. This is called welder's glass. So you get this from a welding supply company, and it's welder's glass number 14. 14. I've used this particular piece of glass at many eclipses. It's essentially equivalent to these eclipse glasses. So this is perfectly good and perfectly safe. Something else you can experience if you're in the path of totality. Remember, it's the shadow of the moon that is reaching down 360,000 kilometers, touching the earth. You can see the shadow coming before it gets to you. It's an amazing sight. You look towards the west. Remember, it's coming from west to east over the surface of the earth. You can see this wall of darkness coming when it's more than 100 miles away. It arrives, and then you're in the shadow. And if you have a few clouds in the sky, you can actually see the edge of the shadow crossing the clouds. An absolutely amazing and stunning sight. Now, if there's no more questions.
It doesn't look like there is at the moment, Howard. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So how about if I end on a high note? Can you give me about 75 more seconds? All right.
Sure.
So I'm going to get rid of the floating controls. We will go back to this. Now, why would I mention Halloween 2006? You see, that year my wife and I had been to the eclipse in the Middle East in March, and on Halloween we were invited to a Halloween party. So people were going dressed up as kings and queens and hobgoblins, and we went dressed as a total eclipse of the sun. So there we are. My wife created the costume. We have it in a closet somewhere. We'll probably bring it out again one day. And I'd just like to show you something that the Canadian Space Agency has done for the upcoming eclipse. They created a simulation of what the eclipse would look like if you were in space looking down at the Earth. And you will see here, and this is only about 30 seconds long, you will see the shadow of the moon crossing the Pacific Ocean, coming up over Mexico, coming up through the United States, and then crossing Ontario and Quebec and the Maritimes, where the sky is clear. So watch this. Texas, Arkansas, Illinois, Ohio, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Newfoundland. They did, I think, a beautiful, beautiful job with that. So this has been a wonderful pleasure for me. I really thank you for the opportunity, and I wish everyone tremendous success and clear skies on the 8th of April. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, thank you. I don't know if Kathy's there or not, because Kathy was going to say a quick thank you. Kathy, are you still there? There you are. Just
Oh, yes, I'm there, and I'm absolutely tongue-tied because I think, Howard, you've just said it all. Thank you for absolutely phenomenal presentation, and I sure hope that we all get that cloudless sky. Thank you so much for coming to the LKO and offering to give us this talk. We are so blessed for having it. Thank you.
everybody a round of applause. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Howard.
Well done. It was just so informative. Thank you.
And I will send the handouts to the LKO board within 5 minutes. And so you can make those available. And that would be just great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and all your knowledge. Thank you.
Good night, all.
Good night, everybody.
Howard.
Take care.
Thank you.
See everybody next week if you're interested for the next one, and on April the 17th. Stay tuned for some social media.